Well, this is our first meeting, obviously, and I wanted to take a bit of time to talk about the text itself and how we read the Bible, because it's not easy. It's not an easy thing just to jump into, and we're starting with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament we used to call it, it's a whole collection of works from many people, and probably from the 12th, written probably from the 12th to the 2nd century BC. So there's a 1,000 years during which it was written by a lot of different people and put together. And mostly it was written in Hebrew, therefore we call it the Hebrew Bible, although some of it, sections of it, we only have in Aramaic, which is a language related to Hebrew, which was probably the one Jesus spoke. But the temple in Jerusalem, the Romans destroyed it in the year 70, in our year, 70 AD. And with that event, very few texts survived. A great many of them were lost, and because the Romans, destroyed the temple and everything connected with it. So it was about 70 AD when that happened, and shortly after that, the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, got together and said, we have to do something. And they never had, until that point, a real canon of Old Testament. They had all these, scrolls and prophetic writings and all sorts of things, but they had never canonized what would be authoritative. And so at that was when they pulled all of these things together to make the Hebrew Bible officially. And I sometimes think it's almost a little bit like a scrapbook. That I remember when I was a kid, scrapbooks were big things. I remember a lady who cut every article that she could out of the paper that had anything to do with it started with the two princesses and right through the king's death and the coronation of everything. And so there was a theme that ran through her scrapbook, anything royal. Now, some of it were stories, some of it were photographs. I had a scrapbook we had to make one for school when I was about 12. We took a bus trip to Ottawa, which was, not nearly as thrilling as the kids seem to do these days. But, I made a scrapbook and there was a little bit about it. I remember I had a picture of the Parliamentary Library, which I thought was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen at that time. And I had a matchbook from a restaurant. Remember they had things of matches on the table, so I and taped that in. And I even had, we went to Rideau Hall, and I took a couple of leaves from a leaf from a tree that JFK planted, and a leaf from a tree that Jacqueline planted, and I taped them in my. And I think Scripture's kind of like that. There are all sorts of things in the Hebrew Bible that come from all different directions, and they're all different in kind as well. For example, there are histories, and there are prayers, and there are poems, there are stories, there are fables and legends, there are even decorating tips if you want to build a temple. And all of these things are stuck in there. But the thing is, we forget that you have to read each of those types of things with a different mindset, because their purpose is to do something different than this purpose is to do. But most likely there's a theme or an arc that runs through it that somehow connects them. And but the thing as well is, until the time of the Reformation, we didn't worry too much about literally believing Scripture. That it was mainly, people just accepted the story as the story and they thought it was true. But it's only in our time that we've started arguing and being so firm about you have to believe it literally or not, or you can't do this or that. And to me, the early church had 2 levels of reading Scripture. They had what they called the historical one, which is what the writer maybe intended if they could get to the bottom of this, or what it meant in terms of whether it was true or not. And there are a lot of inaccuracies historically in the Scripture. But then they also said, but more important than that, it's the meaning. Like, what does this mean to us? What is God saying to us in this? Not what God was saying 1,000 years ago to this person. But it still connects to who we are. And I just wanted to, I hope this is all right, but I just want to read you a little book, a little story. And it's a children's book that I used to use a lot because I think it's very helpful to get our mind around how different stories need different ways of reading them. And it's called, Is That Story True? Okay. Every night before bed, Maggie and Mummy read stories together. Maggie chooses a book and finds Neville her stuffed ostrich. They make a cozy nest on Mummy's lap and snuggle together under a favorite quilt. And every night, Maggie asks the same question. One night, Maggie and Mummy read a story about a little girl who lived on the prairies many years ago. This little girl went to school with only one room, had a chicken for a pet, and had to go to the bathroom in a little shed called an outhouse. One day, her brothers locked her in the outhouse and set the goat loose. The goat knocked the outhouse right over, and the brothers got in big trouble. Is that story true? Said Maggie. Well, said Mummy, the little girl in the story was a real person. And when she got older, she gathered all the stories she could remember and wrote them down. And I don't know if everything happened exactly the way she remembered it. But I think her stories give us a true sense of what it was like to grow up in that place and at that time. I see, said Maggie, and climbed into bed. The next night, they read a story about a young king. The king went to visit a faraway land, and there he heard about a special rope which had been tied into a very large and complicated knot. It was said that whoever could undo the knot would become the ruler of the whole world. Of course, the young king wanted to see if he could solve the puzzle. When he saw the knot, he looked at it carefully and thought for a few minutes, and then he drew his sharp sword and with one swift stroke sliced the knot in two. Is that story true? Said Maggie. Well, said Mummy, the king in the story actually lived. His name was Alexander. And I don't know whether he really cut the knot in half with his sword, but he was certainly bold and clever, and he was good at seeing ways to do things that other people thought could not be done. So, I suppose this story tells us something about Alexander that is true. I see, said Maggie, and climbed into bed. The next night, they read about a shepherd who looked after many sheep. Every night when the sheep came back to the sheepfold, the shepherd would count them. And one night, one sheep was missing. So the shepherd went out into the darkness to look for the sheep that was lost. Uphill and down through the shadowy woods where wild animals roamed, along narrow paths, the shepherd searched until at last he found the sheep. It was hiding behind a rock, cold and afraid. Gently, the shepherd took the sheep in his arms and brought it safely home. Is that story true? Said Maggie. Well, said Mummy, do you remember the time you were lost? Yes, said Maggie, you looked and looked for me until you found me. I think I know how the sheep felt. Do you, said Mummy. Then I guess this story is true. The next night they read about another king. This king was granted one wish. Because he loved money, he wished that everything he touched would turn into gold. I would like that, Maggie interrupted. Would you, asked Mummy. Keep listening. The king had made a foolish wish, for when he sat down at his table for supper, the food turned into gold as soon as he touched it, and he could not eat a thing. His clothes became gold and weighed him down. Hungry and tired, he called to his children to keep him company. But when he reached out to hug them, they turned into gold statues, and he was left alone. Is that story true, said Maggie. Well, said Mummy, this story didn't really happen. No one can turn things into gold by touching them. But what does this story mean? When we are greedy and want more and more, sometimes we end up losing the most important things. Do you think that is true? I don't know, said Maggie. Think about it, said Mummy, and kissed Maggie goodnight. And the next night they read a story about a beautiful garden. Children loved to play among the flowers and eat the juicy fruit from the trees. They did not know that the garden belonged to a giant. And one day the giant came home from traveling and found the children in his garden. He was very angry and roared at them to go away. Frightened, the children ran away and did not return. The giant built a huge stone wall around the garden to keep the children out. And as the months passed, the giant realized that spring was very slow to come. In fact, winter seemed to go on and on. Alone in the garden, the giant felt sad and lonely. His garden no longer seemed beautiful. But one morning, he woke to hear the drip, drip of the melting snow. And when he looked outside, he saw buds on the trees and crocuses peeking through the snowbanks. Spring had come at last. And when the giant went up to enjoy the garden, he saw why. The children had crept over the walls and climbed the trees. They had brought life and warmth with them. Is that story true? Asked Maggie. Well, said Mummy, what happens when people are selfish and will not share the beautiful things they have in their lives? What happens when people build walls to keep others out? Maybe they get lonely, suggested Maggie. Maybe, said Mummy. Maybe they feel cold and dead, like it's winter inside them. Maybe. Mummy, said Maggie, I've been thinking about what I love. I think that some stories are true on the inside, even if they're not true on the outside. Mummy smiled and said, I think you may be right. Maggie climbed into bed. I love you, dear one, said Mummy. Is that true? Asked Maggie. Mummy smiled again and kissed Maggie on her forehead. Absolutely, she said. I think, each of those stories was a different type of story and had a different truth in it. And I think Scripture is often like that as well. And so for me, it's not worth arguing over whether the ark was really happened and how could two animals go into it? No, well, it was big enough and it had all these stories. And to me, that's missing the point of the story. It's missing the truth of the story for an argument. And I think there are a lot of Bible stories like that. And there are others that are prayers and psalms and songs, and the parables of Jesus were never meant to be taken literally. They were stories he told to tell another truth. So the 5 stories we read for tonight, were you able to read them? Even anybody? Anyways, the 5 stories we read were, I just have to remind myself, this section is called In the Beginning. And so the first story was the creation story, and the second one was Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden when they sinned. And the third one, oh gosh, I gotta find it. Okay, who read it that can remember? Oh, the Adam and Eve story, and then the story of Noah and his ark was the third one, and the and the Tower of Babel was another one. The Tower of Babel story, anyways. Somehow that was only 4. Anyways, I can tell you exactly what they were. Yeah, in the beginning, the creation story, the Adam and Eve story, the story of Noah, and there was another story about Noah after the ark, and then the Tower of Babel story. But I think it's important that we realize that these were all prehistory story. And there are a lot of legends in every nation about floods and all of that. And there's maybe a core of truth in those stories. But again, the question is not to build an ark. Like somewhere down in the States, a friend of mine, not a friend of mine, so someone I know by marriage, who went to this big display, and he was going on how wonderful it was that someone had recreated the ark, and it was true. And I don't know where it is, some down in the States, and showed what it would have looked like, and all the rest of it. But to me, that misses the point. And when we go back to the most interesting one, I find, is the creation story, in which God creates everything out of nothing. You know, he says, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be this, and there was that. And it just happened. But the interesting thing for me in that story is that the only one that doesn't happen like that is the creation of human beings. That God does not create human beings out of nothing the way everything else happens. He creates humans out of what he has already created. And he doesn't say, he says, what does he say? I'm going to create a human being after my image. So in all the others, God says, let there be light, and there was, let there be, and then when it comes to human, he says, let us create a human being. And it's almost as if he's saying, let us create, he does say, let us create a human being in our image, in my image. And I always find that really interesting, because it's done in such a way that it sounds as if the creation of human beings is an ongoing thing. It starts with God doing something, and then we spend our lives growing into being God's image. And I think that gives us a whole different understanding of what we do in life, and how we all grow and change, and God invites us into his life. It's also interesting that in the creation story that he realizes human beings need community. He creates a companion, an equal companion for the first person he creates. And just perhaps it's possible that the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is echoed in the fact that God himself is a community of people, of persons, and we are invited to join into that. grow into that throughout our lives, and that's what it means to be a human being. Someone who grows into relationship with the community and with God. And I think that is hinted at in the creation story. And then the breakup of the community, of course, in the story of the Tower of Babel, where human beings are, the community is broken and scattered, and nothing is ever the same again. Anyways, the 5 stories are, we can't read them all, but I'm not quite sure what we want to talk about now, but I think I've talked enough, so.